Everyone, and maybe afternoon or morning, depending on where you are joining from. And welcome to this month's first webinar session. So now we run twice a month, and I great to finally also on the call, present to you my co-organizer Alex. You know him as a presenter, but now as a co-organizer. So you'll probably begin to see more from both of us. And as usual, the agenda is always the first 5 minutes to quickly do introduction, which is where the stage I'm at now. The topic is today SQL Supercharged, Azure Fabric and Copilot in action. And we already have a speaker. I'm going to talk a bit about him. The questions will be at the end, so you can please put your questions in the chat, and we will make sure that he's aware of them. And at the end, except if he asks me to surface any questions to him during the session, I would not interrupt him, and we will do well not to interrupt him. So a few interesting and developments. I know I mentioned it the last webinar, but because it's still really new, I have to keep mentioning it. So we are now on multiple platforms. I'm going to put all of this in the chat, and we are also working on a website. Things are still fluid, but at least now something is there, I can share it. If you have feedback, you can let us know. And so I'll mention all of these, but just so you know that we try to grow, we try to see how we can go be where people already are and attract also more members, more speakers. And so now to the main reason we are all here. So I know there will be a special way to pronounce his name. Maybe tell me, Javi, how do I pronounce your full name so that I can get it right now?
Javier.
Yeah, Javier. So Javier is a Microsoft MVP. He's an IT director. He's got like over 30 years of experience working across the data space, and like especially SQL Server. I think he's very, very, maybe I don't know, maybe it's his first or his second, but he's very enamored with SQL Server, and he's presents at a lot of sessions. I think this year he presented at the FabCon. He presents at SQL Saturdays. He also has his own technical community that he manages in Latin America. So he's someone who, he's got a lot of experience doing this, and he's passionate about this. He's like, he's ahead in terms of all that is new and upcoming and all the things you should be aware of within the SQL Server, Azure SQL, and now Fabric on the SQL side of Fabric. And today he's going to share with us on that. So I'm going to get out of his way so that we can dive into what he has for us. So I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll turn off my camera and I'll just be in the chat. So over to you, Javier.
Okay. Are you seeing my screen?
Not yet.
No.
You have to reshare. I think when I shared, it took over
Again.
yours.
Okay. Here we go.
Yes, we see your screen now. I think you are the thanks data engineers in Toronto. I don't know if that's your first screen.
This is how I start. Thanking you both, Michael and Alexander, for having me here today. It's a pleasure to me to stay here with you, speaking about the topic that I love, which is data platform, which is SQL Server. So thank you again for this opportunity. So there are no applications, no analytics, no AI if there is no data, right? So the thing that we're going to be talking about today is SQL, which is a big part, a big chunk of what data is for Microsoft and for data platform, right? We're going to be talking about relational data is one aspect of what, we are seeing now today. And the name of this presentation is SQL Server Supercharged, Azure Fabric, and Copilot in action. Right? You have here a little bit more about myself. You have my contact information, my LinkedIn, my X account, my email address, my GitHub account. So if you have any questions or any doubt related to this presentation, feel free to reach out to me. As Michael just mentioned, I work at Mediterranean Shipping Company. I am MVP in the data platform award category. I am also a Microsoft certified trainer and one of the local organizers of our own community here, which is SQL Argentina. Right, we have our monthly meetings. We have in-person event, live event, as much as we can. We try to stay as a community and grow the community, same as you guys are doing here today. So let's start with the presentation. Microsoft SQL, ground to cloud to fabric. This is a marketing phrase, but really explain very well what we are living nowadays, right? SQL Server is not more like this product that we have installed in our big on-premise server, in our own data center, or behind our desk, right? SQL Server nowadays is a platform, right, which cover the SQL Server product, right, the ground, Azure SQL Cloud, and SQL database in Fabric, the brand new component of the SQL ecosystem, right? So the idea today is basically to walk through together on all these three components, see them in action a little bit, describe when to use which one and how to use them. And we're going to be focusing on one specific member of the family, which is SQL Server 2025, right? But we're going to be covering all of them. At the end, we will also see a little bit more on how to interact with the SQL platform using Microsoft Copilot, which is the part that I like the most, right? So SQL Server 2025 is this AI-ready enterprise database from ground to cloud. It's also a marketing phrase, but it's quite accurate because it's AI ready with the new capabilities related to AI in SQL, right? And it's also our enterprise ready database because, we can run our mission critical applications at the top of SQL, right? With high availability, disaster recovery, achieve performance, achieve security, etc., etc., etc. What is also important to mention here is that it doesn't matter where we run our workload, in SQL Server, in Azure SQL, SQL Database, in Fabric, there is a common layer of multiple things that are the same for all of them, right? So where we decide to put our user database to deploy our application, it's not really going to change much because this SQL, the language, translates SQL to write, queries, store procedure, create tables, create relationship, views, triggers, etc. The language that the SQL developers use is the same for all of them. The SQL Server engine, the core of SQL, is the same for all of them. Everything related to tooling, right? So in terms of connectivity, drivers, development tools like, for example, Visual Studio Code, again, doesn't matter which flavor of SQL Server we use, right? Is exactly the same. And of course, Fabric. We know that Microsoft is betting really, really hard on Microsoft Fabric since a couple of years, right? Microsoft Fabric is this end-to-end analytical platform in where we have a SaaS environment, software as a service, and we can deploy our project end-to-end. Also, SQL Server is integrating with Fabric quite smoothly. Why is that? Well, first of all, there is a SQL database in Fabric. And then if we are using one of the other flavors of SQL Server, there are techniques that allow us to synchronize, to replicate, to mirror our operational data into Fabric right away. So we can then do analytics using real-time data. And of course, AI and Copilot, right? We see the growth of AI applications also in relational databases, right? So now SQL Server has a native data type called vector in where we can store embeddings and do, for example, smart searching based on AI function. And finally, Copilot. We see Microsoft deploying Copilot almost everywhere in all their products and services. And well, SQL Server is not the exception, right? So if we move on and we try to expand a little bit more on what we saw on the previous slide, we can go deeper into each of these categories of Microsoft SQL ground to cloud to Fabric. SQL Server is the product that, again, we've been using for more than 30 years, right? But we had this great surprise back in SQL Server 2017, right, in where Microsoft gave us the chance to use SQL Server at the top of Linux OS, right? We can choose our favorite Linux distribution, ideally the enterprise-related one, SUSE, Ubuntu, Red Hat, and we can run SQL Server at the top of it with absolutely no problem. I get this question all the time. Is it better to run it at the top of Linux, at the top of Windows, as we've been doing it forever? And the answer is it's more related to your IT scope, right? If they are used to work with Windows, well, we can run SQL Server in Windows, as we've been doing it for years. If your IT department has a knowledge in Linux, well, then SQL Server can adapt and run on it with absolutely no problem. There are no differences between one or the other. Right? At the same time, in SQL Server 2017, Microsoft gave us the possibility to run SQL Server at the top of containers in Kubernetes, in Docker, right? If we want to develop SQL application in a containerized environment, we can do it with Docker and with any SQL Server version starting from 2017, right? Then we have Azure, right? Azure is the Microsoft cloud in where there are multiple services deployed. And SQL, again, is not the exception. We have multiple options over there, and we're going to go deep into it in a minute. And finally, Fabric SQL Database, which was released as general availability last November during Microsoft Ignite, right? So this is the footprint. We're going to go through each of them a little bit more in deep, right? So we learn more of each of these components. So let's focus on SQL Server 2025, announced as general available since also November last year during Ignite, right? The AI-ready enterprise database from ground to cloud. And there are three main pillars in this specific SQL Server build, right? We mentioned SQL Server 2017, right, in where Linux was the main feature, right? I mean, it's really not a feature, but it was the main star of that specific SQL Server version. In this one, right, the main feature is AI built in, right? The possibility to store AI data, right, on embeddings, right, in vector data types, right, but not hosting the AI models, the LLMs within the SQL Server, right? SQL use a technique to connect to the network or to connect to a cloud provider, like, for example, Azure OpenAI, right? And connect to this large language model, get the embeddings. The embeddings is the representation of a string, of a character, a description, right? as a vector and then store it within the database. And with several functions available, we can do smart searching, right? In SQL Server, doing the search till now was a little bit hard because we don't have many tools, or the tools are quite hard to use because you have to specify exactly the right text pattern, right? Now, with embeddings, with search by proximity, right? We can be looking for text that is not exactly within the phrase that we are looking, but is talking about the same thing, right? Like, for example, if we're working on the Adventure Works database, that we know that it's a system that store, a seller of bikes, mountain bikes, and outdoor sports. We can, for example, ask SQL, give me all the accessories related to the head, and we're going to get as an answer helmets, glasses, and those kind of things. And maybe the word or the term head is not even present in the text, right? So it's really, really powerful. And Microsoft have done it quite well. That, again, is not within the database, because that's going to be a big problem, right? Because if we host locally, eventually we can do it, right? But it's not the right way. But we also have the possibility to go outside and look for these external models, right? And get these embeddings, right? So this way, SQL Server continue being SQL, the enterprise ready database in where we can host, our mission critical application, but also we can develop AI application, right? The other main pillar is for developers, right? Develop modern data applications. There are a set of features within SQL Server 2025, and also, the SQL ecosystem, Azure SQL DB and Fabric SQL DB, right? That gives the developers a lot of flexibility to create modern data application, right? We're going to go deep into it in a little bit details in few slides. And also, as I mentioned before, the integration of your operational data with Microsoft Fabric, having this seamless synchronization, seamless mirroring of our operational data into one lake in Fabric, to use that operational data to do, for example, reports or dashboard with data in real time, right? As usual, SQL Server is secure by default and has this mission critical engine. Secure by default, this is because it's the engine with less amount of critical flaws or holes detected over the last several years if we compare with other major database engine providers, right? And in this version, SQL Server keeps betting on security, right? With the integration of Microsoft Entra ID, for example, right? With Defender and few other things for security purposes. And of course, mission critical engine. Microsoft still focus SQL for us to run our mission critical databases. If we have a database that has to run 24/7 with high availability, disaster recovery, good performance, and securely, definitely SQL Server is the way to go. And in this version, there are also a lot of features targeted to that end, right? As we mentioned before, right, is assist by Copilot in all the ways, right? It's a leader in the benchmarking area. So there are, multiple benchmarks that has been done, and Microsoft is still the leader in most of them. And this specific build is optimized for the latest and greatest hardware, for modern hardware, right? So if we have a modern, server, right, with a modern processor, etc., SQL Server will definitely run better. All right. Remember in the previous slide, I mentioned the features for developers, right? So I would like to go in deep into it, because besides AI, which is of course super important, developers is one of the main features also in SQL Server 2025 and the whole ecosystem, as I said. I had the opportunity to deliver a presentation in the last SQL FabCon in Atlanta, only on developer features for SQL Server 2025, right? So there is a lot to talk about it, right? So let's try to summarize it as much as we can. Let's imagine that the dot rectangle is our host running SQL Server, right? Again, any flavor. So let's see which are the components and the features for SQL Server. First of all, Data API Builder, right? This is not part of SQL. This is external. This is a .NET application that we can go and download and install in any host, right? And connect to SQL Server, not only SQL Server 25, not only Azure SQL, we can connect to every single SQL Server version, right? And make a REST API endpoint for SQL, right? So we install this API builder, right? We point it to our SQL Server, we point it to our tables, to our store procedures, and then we can have external applications that connect to data API builders and retrieve the data through REST API endpoint, right? In JSON format, in XML format, in text format, whatever we define. Right? So Data API Builder is definitely one of the biggest improvement for data integration, right? We can present the context, the data of our SQL Server to the outside using REST API endpoint. This is super, super important for integration, as I mentioned before. Then, within SQL Server, now, for the very, very first time, we have a JSON native data type, right? So before SQL Server 2025, we were able to store JSON data, but in string format, in rmarcar or varchar, right? Now we have a native JSON data type in where we can store JSON documents, right? And we can have a validation to see if the document is properly formatted, etc., right? And is, native right now. We also have indexing, right? If we want to look through the JSON documents through a specific node or a specific value inside the document, right? We're going to use these indexes to improve the performance. And there are updated T-SQL functions in order to manipulate the JSON documents, right? Additionally, on the T-SQL space, there are a lot of improvement in the area of regular expression, regx, right? So these are super cool when we are dealing with data search, right? If we want to, instead of using a fixed character or a fixed string or a fixed phrase, we can use regular expression to look for data. And now with these new functions or updated functions, we can use regular expression in places that before we were not able to do it. Like, for example, on a constraint, right? We can create a constraint with a regular expression, using regular expression, right? So we can do, for example, we want to store telephone numbers in that specific fields, and we can create the constraint with the proper telephone number format that we want to use, right? With parentheses, with dashes, whatever, right? So if the text is not inserted, if the phone number is not updated with the proper format defined in the constraint, it's going to fail on the insert, right? So super, super cool. And additionally, there are two other features which are really great. The one that I like the most, and actually I've been using it quite a lot, is change event streaming. And let me do a quick parenthesis here to explain something specifically about this feature. As I said, SQL Server 2025 was presented as GA in November last year. But SQL has the possibility to turn on preview features at database level. So there is a database scope configuration settings, right, in where we can enable preview features. What are these preview features? Well, basically, we can test some features that Microsoft is still developing, right? Working on it and making some improvement through the cumulative updates that they deliver on a monthly basis, right? But we are not allowed to use them in production unless we talk directly with Microsoft, right? That is why these are preview features, right? So if we want to use some of these features, right, the preview features, we have to enable it at database level. And change event streaming is one of those features that is still in preview, right? What can we do with change event streaming, right? Well, basically, I imagine that some of you know change data capture, CDC, right? And for the one that are not familiar with CDC, basically is that every time that we do an insert, update, delete in one specific table or multiple tables, right? But let's say only one table, every time we insert, update, delete, SQL Server generate a new entry on a separate table, which is on a different schema, right? Just to keep up with the changes, right? So if we do insert, it's going to create a new row with the insertion. If we do an update, it's going to create another entry on this table with the previous values and the old values. If we do a delete, it's also going to insert a new row into this table, which again is separate. It's a separate schema, separate table name, etc. Right? And we can keep track of the changes within this, right? So if we want to consume these changes somehow, we need to pull this from an external application, go every so often and try to get the deltas, get the changes, right? If we need to feed our application, let's say, right? So what is change event streaming? Something quite similar, but instead of storing the data within our database, different schema, different table, what we're going to be doing is pushing these changes in JSON format, right, through an Azure Service Hub as an event, right? So every insert, update, delete, we're going to generate this change, this event that will go to Azure Event Hub, right? And will live there for certain amount of time, depending on how Azure Event Hub is configured. So we can have multiple consumers, right? Multiple applications consuming the same data at the same time. But instead of going to the user database and pull for this application on a scheduled basis, right, we can get it directly as an event in Azure Event. Super, super powerful, right? Finally, REST API. There is a store procedure in SQL Server, right, that allow us to connect to external REST API endpoints, right? Remember what I mentioned at the beginning, data API builder, other applications connecting to our SQL Server. What I'm mentioning here is that from within SQL Server, using the T-SQL language that we all been using forever, right? We can connect to a REST API endpoint, right, securely, and get the data in JSON format, and then we can, parse it and store it and manipulate it as we want. So this is really, really powerful, right? Again, for the purpose of data integration, integrating SQL Server, right, with other third-party or external applications, right? Before this, maybe we were doing link server calls or an integration service packages to move data from here to there, etc. Now, directly from and to SQL Server with Data API Builder and with REST API endpoint in SQL, right? We can connect to REST API. So super, super powerful. Additionally, we have GitHub Copilot in SQL Server, right? So we can use the GitHub Copilot license with Visual Studio Code or with Marshmallow Studio, right? We're going to see it in a demo later on. And we can use Copilot this way to interact with this Copilot interface with our data. And finally, Microsoft Python driver for SQL Server. For the very first time, there is a native Python client for SQL Server. We don't have to use ODBC anymore, right? Those crazy things that we've been using till now. Now there is this native driver for Python. Super cool. By the way, if there are questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat and let me know so we can answer them. So if not, I continue moving on. So on the mission critical space, right, there are certain features in each of the areas, right? For improve the concurrency, for accelerate the performance, and to increase high availability and disaster recovery, right? For the improvement on the concurrency, there is this new feature called optimize locking, right? Which is actually super cool. What can we do with optimize locking? Well, it's a different way that the engine handles the internal lockings, right? So, a lock is basically when we have a session that is using an object, a table, for example, and we have multiple sessions trying to access the same page or do the same update at the same time, etc., etc., etc. So if we have this concurrency till now, right, there are certain scenarios in where locks can be generated. A lock is one session that holds another one, so until it finishes, the other ones are not able to continue, right? This kind of serialize the workload, right? So instead of running in parallel, right, they run one by one till the logs has been released, right? With optimized locking, right, Microsoft has changed internally to allow more concurrency on a specific table, a specific object. So with that, we don't have to wait for the lock to, or for the transaction or the session to finish. We can also work at the same time in parallel. And this generates more concurrency. And with more concurrency, guess what? We have better performance, right? So optimized locking is a feature that Microsoft has been testing for years in Azure SQL, right? Because Microsoft actually, they implement new features in Azure SQL first, and then they bring the features to the SQL Server product, right? So optimized locking, really, really cool. In the area of performance, right, there are several enhancements in intelligent query processing, IQP, right? Intelligent query processing is this mechanism that Microsoft has in SQL Server to, enhance the performance, but even more important, at least to me, is to maintain the performance constant, right? So it doesn't matter if we have a big change on a plan or those kind of things. It's just to, this workload always take the same amount of time, right? So there are a lot of improvement in this area. And for the very first time, we have query store on read replicas, right? Before SQL Server 2025, we have a single query store on the primary, which is replicated to the read-only replica. So, they have some problems to get the query store data on the replicas. Now we have a specific version on the replicas, right? So the workload that goes through the replicas has its own query store information. So super, super cool. And again, with that, we accelerate on the performance. And in terms of high availability and disaster recovery, right, there are more reliable failover for availability groups, and there are better tools to do tuning and diagnostics when we have to work with availability groups. And finally, there are a lot of enhancements in the area of backups, right? There is a new algorithm for compression when we do backup compression, in where we can, take more or less the same amount of time that before, but compress the backups even more, right? And now, for the very first time, we have the possibility to take all the backups from the replicas, full, differential, or transaction logs, right? From any of the replicas. Till the previous SQL Server version, we were only able to take transaction logs backups from the replicas, but the full backup has to be taken on the primary, right? Now we can offload completely all the backup activities to any of the replicas. Super, super cool. I see there is a question, Michael.
Yes, there are two. Do you want me to read them?
Yes, please.
Okay. So from Madeleke Michael is asking, am I able to leverage these AI embeddings vectors in Fabric warehouses?
Actually, in Fabric SQL database or SQL database in Fabric, you have the possibility to store embeddings vector. I may have to go back to you. I believe it's still not possible, but I'm not 100% sure if in Fabric Data Warehouse we can have embeddings. My guess is that not yet, right? Most probably it will, because they will try to make it parity. But to be honest, I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. And there's one more question. So while you are showing about the native Python driver, someone is asking, BD is asking that you tell us more about the Python driver.
Yes, absolutely. You go to the libraries, you will find Microsoft SQL Server connectivity, you download your references, and boom, that's it. Then you generate your connection string, as simple as that, right? Again, before we had to use ODBC, so we have to install the driver, generate the string on ODBC, and then reference the connection through ODBC. And that was not native and not so performant, let's say, right? So now with this driver, we can connect our Python application directly to SQL Server. All right, I see you put there some reference. Thank you so much. There's a lot of information in the Microsoft Learn page about, SQL Server and any single feature of it, right? So please, please, please go for it. Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on. Azure SQL, right? We briefly mentioned Azure SQL before, and we have these two main buckets: infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. In infrastructure as a service, we have virtual machines running SQL Server, Azure virtual machines running SQL Server, right? So this is called infrastructure as a service because we have to manage the infrastructure. We have to handle the OS, the infrastructure behind the scenes. So we can choose either Windows or Linux, but we have to take care of it, right? If we want to achieve high availability, we have to set up another virtual machine and generate the cluster and the availability groups, etc., etc. When there is a patch for the OS, we need to apply the patch as well. When there is a patch for SQL Server, we need to apply it ourselves, right? When we need to take a backup, we need to do it ourselves. Actually, how we've been doing it in our on-premise environment, right? But what is one of the benefits of this Azure SQL VMs, right? And to me, it's one of the most important. And then when we go to the whole Azure SQL benefit, we're going to dig a little bit more. But if we decide to install our workload on an Azure SQL VM, right? We go to a marketplace and we choose the combination of operating system version edition with SQL Server version edition, right? And boom, we deploy it in few minutes, right? But beside that, I would say the main thing here is that in this installation, several items from the SQL Server best practices are already in when we install these VMs, right? For example, putting the TempDB on a separate drive, putting the data files on one specific drive, the log files on a different files, configure the max DOP, configure the memory settings, etc., etc., etc. If you are not an experienced DBA, you may probably just go download the installer and do next, finish, deploy your database. Probably it's going to run well for a couple of days, and then when start hammering, it's going to run really, really bad, right? And why is that? Because there is no post setup or post installation configuration, right? Because there are many things to change, right, or to adjust, right? Some of them, I will say, some of the most important ones, right, are already on this VM when we deploy it, right? So this is something important to bear in mind. Then we have platform as a service, right? And within this category, we have two flavors: Azure SQL Database, targeted for modern cloud applications, right? And Azure SQL Managed Instance, which is a modernized version of our existing applications in SQL. So why we have two flavors if we can have only one? First of all, this is SQL as a service, not as infrastructure. So we go to the portal, we deploy one Azure SQL DB, one Azure SQL Managed Instance, or MI, right? And boom, what we're gonna have over there, right, is a SQL endpoint. We don't know what is the infrastructure that is behind the scene, right? We don't have access to the disk, to the OS, to the patches. No, Microsoft takes care of all that infrastructure for us behind the scenes. So we only deal with SQL endpoint, and we connect with Management Studio, Visual Studio, any application that we use, right? So this is SQL as a service. And why we have two, right? Well, Azure SQL Database, as I said earlier, is targeted to modern cloud applications. Even if, as I said at the beginning, the tooling, the engine, and the T-SQL is exactly the same, is targeted to this modern application. And there are certain caveats or characteristics on each of these, right? MI or Azure SQL DB, right? Which made them unique, right? For Azure SQL DB, for example, everything has to live within the same user database. What does it mean? In SQL Server, we can have multiple databases, and if we have the proper permissions, we can join data that is sitting in tables which are located in different user databases. In Azure SQL DB, that is not possible. Everything has to live within the same user database, right? So you cannot go externally, right? Is this a limitation? No, I would say that this is a characteristic of this one. And again, if today we have to build a brand new application from scratch and we need a relational engine behind the things, right? Definitely Azure SQL is something to consider if we need to start our application from scratch. So this concept of Azure SQL DB, by the way, Azure SQL Database was one of the first services in Azure when Azure was released 15, 20 years ago. I don't remember exactly, right? Of course, it has evolved a lot, right? And, people start liking the concept of platform as a service just to deal with the endpoint and not with the infrastructure, right? We say, okay, this is good, but I would like to have something more similar to what SQL Server is, with multiple databases, with the SQL Server agent, with replication, with everything, right? And but as a service. And this is when Microsoft has released Managed Instance. It's near 100% compatible with SQL Server, right? But as a service. So no patching. We don't have to do patching at all on the OS or at the SQL Server level, right? Microsoft is taking care of the backups, etc., and we can move our databases just with the backup restore, right? Super, super cool. Okay, what are the benefits of Azure SQL, right? There are several, but let's describe them in groups. Business continuity, high availability, and automate backups, right? Business continuity and high availability basically is that, if we have to build high availability in SQL Server, we have to create the cluster, the availability groups, deploy it in multiple data centers, have the connectivity, etc., etc., etc. This is not impossible. We do it all the time, actually, but it takes a lot of work and also a lot of maintenance. In Azure SQL MI or Azure SQL DB, right, you achieve high availability and disaster recovery just, marking one checkbox, right? And of course, it's going to cost you more, right? But in a matter of minutes, you will have your databases geo-replicated with HADR. Super, super cool. As I mentioned before briefly, we can have automated backups. So we don't have to deal with full differential transaction. No, Microsoft take care of the backups automatically, right? And also long-term retention and geo-replication. What does it mean? If we work with the best practices for backups, we of course have to have the backups stored for certain amount of time, right? And the best practices are also saying that you cannot store the backups. First of all, you cannot store it within the same server, but also you cannot store it on the same building in where you have your main system. Why is that? Because if you have a problem with the building, right, there is a disaster and you cannot even access the building, you cannot access your server, neither the backups, right? So Azure SQL takes care of the retention and also to shear replicate the backups to a different Azure region, so you have a copy of all your backups, right, in case you need them, right, in case Microsoft has a major disaster in one of the regions, you can access this to the backups really easy. And then to me, the most important one, scalability, right? Scalability is something that when we have to create an application and we need to say, okay, how many cores, what type of memory, how many gigabyte of memory, how many disks, the IOPS, etc. And we have to do it in the on-premise environment. We have to do it very well, because we're going to put our application there, and then if we have a bottleneck, right? For example, let's say that our business goes super well, or we have a peak season like Christmas, Thanksgiving, or whatever, right? And we have extra activity on that, we're going to start having problems with bottleneck. That is why we have to scale it or define it properly. In Azure SQL, we can scale up, right? If we need more resources, more CPU, more memory, faster disk, etc., right? For a certain amount of time, for example, during the peak season, right? And then eventually scale it down to the original size, right? So super cool. You can do it easily, right? And really nice. This is my favorite benefit in Azure SQL. And then, of course, the advanced security of SQL Server itself, as I mentioned earlier, but also the security in Azure. Also important to mention that in Azure SQL DB and managed instance, you have this concept of versionless, right? There is no SQL Server 2000, 2012, 2022. No, it's versionless. It's Azure SQL. So you don't have to deal with a specific version, right? Does it mean that Microsoft is not innovating because it's always the same SQL Server version? Absolutely not. It's the other way around, actually, right? Microsoft innovate first on Azure SQL and then bring those features to the SQL Server product, right? Here are some of the latest innovation in Azure SQL, right? There is an Azure SQL Hub in the portal, the Copilot Studio connector in Azure SQL, and the one that we see here in the list. Finally, SQL database in Fabric, right? What is this concept of SQL database in Fabric? This is actually targeted to build AI application faster and easier than ever, right? And it has three main areas: to be simple, to be autonomous and secure, and to be optimized for AI. Simple is because when you go to the Fabric portal, you go to create new item, Fabric SQL database, you specify the name, boom, ready. You have your database over there, right? In Azure SQL, in SQL Server, there are several knobs that you have to do. For example, if you create a managed instance, you have to select the service tier, if it is general purpose or business critical, the amount of B cores, the memory, the IOPS, etc., right? SQL database in Fabric is extremely simple. Right? So create database, name, boom, that's it. Autonomous and secure. The idea is to be able to have this running all the time with the no need of a database administrator behind the scenes to work with that, right? So that is why Microsoft is trying to make it autonomous, or as autonomous as possible. And then secure, right? So all the benefits of SQL in terms of security, but there is a important caveat here. SQL database in Fabric does not support SQL authentication, only Microsoft Entra ID authentication. This is the first step on removing, right, SQL authentication here. And then optimize for AI. Everything that I said before, the vector data types, the embeddings, the store, etc., 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 is in Fabric, in SQL database for Fabric, right? Is GA generally available since November last year, right? And is available for you to use it at any time. Then the integration with Microsoft Fabric, right? We have Fabric, as I mentioned before, with all the different workloads, with data factory, data warehouse, data engineering, machine learning, etc., right? But if we need to use our data, our operational data, and synchronize it, replicate it, or mirroring into one lake, right? We can do it, right? And this technology is in general available. What is this? Let's say that we have our mission critical application running on premise on SQL Server, right? And we have a stock that we have to control. So we have new items in where we add new items, we remove new items, or we are selling something specifically. So we sell something or we buy something, right? So this application will insert data into our user database. This data will go directly into Fabric in near real time. So in a matter of seconds, we're going to have this data available in case we need to do analytics with this data. So super, super cool. We can do it super easily, right? And finally, Management Studio 22, right? This is the latest and greatest version, also in GA, right? Support for SQL Server 2025 and Fabric integration. Also the possibility to use GitHub Copilot, support for Windows ARM64. And, since we have in SQL JSON data type, there is a JSON viewer on it. So super, super cool. The Microsoft SQL extension for Visual Studio Code, right, with integration for GitHub Copilot, schema design, query plan visualizer, etc., etc., etc. And then we have SQL Copilot, right? SQL Copilot is a super interesting interface to connect to SQL. And Copilot has two main skills. What are these skills? Well, we can divide them into this group: database administrator skills and developer skills, right? If we go to database administrator, right, we can interact with SQL Server, actually any version, right? And we can ask, hey, SQL, when was the last time that I took a full backup of my databases? Are my statistics up to date? Do I need to do an index rebuild? Do I have logins? Why my database is running slow, right? So we can interact with SQL in natural language, right? Plain English or Spanish or any other language, right? And you can have this interface to chat with your database engine. Right? So, it's for you to use it. And, over the years, we have created a bunch of scripts to do almost everything, right? Check the statistics, the index fragmentation, the status of the backups, the logins, etc., etc. But now, if we don't have those scripts handy, we can just chat directly with the database. And then for developers, right? The other skill for developers, we can say, hey, Copilot, can you check this store procedure and see if it is written following the SQL best practices, right? It will analyze the code and it will give you all the proposals for enhance, the coding just to match it with the best practice. right? And also in the development area, let's say that you start a brand new shop, first day, right? You know that you have a user database, you know that the business is related to sales of a specific product, but you don't know the architecture behind the scenes. You don't know the table names, the columns, the relationships, the primary keys. You know nothing. You can start chatting with Copilot and say, hey, Copilot, give me the sales of this specific product on this specific quarter and compare with the previous quarter, right? What Copilot will do is analyze all the metadata, will generate the T-SQL code, right? And will run it and will get the result for you. It's important to mention, remember, we talk about security quite a while, actually. If your connection has, permissions to have read only on one table in your user database, Copilot will use that connection and will only use that table, right, with those permissions to get the answer, right? It's not because it's using AI or Copilot that will have, God rights and will be able to do everything, right? No, it will use your current security content, right, in order to get your answer. Super, super cool, right? So it's basically utilizing natural language, right? And in Azure, we can ask things like, for example, why my database is slow, right? And it will analyze and will find and the queries and say, hey, listen, maybe there is a store proceed or a missing index or something like that, right? Can I tune that high CPU query? Okay, it just gives us the a missing index to create, etc., etc. So why we don't see it in action? Michael, I see that there are some questions before we go to the demo.
Okay. I think you've already caught the immediate one after the set we answered. So I think, yeah, Hannah was asking, will there be any demo tutorial to show us the theory in practice? So I know the content you are presenting on is a lot, and some of them are mentioning what's new. So I kind of just set the expectation that, we can have a demo for all of this in 1 hour session. But I'm glad you have some demo. So hopefully maybe the ones you will do will be the parts he wants or he wants. I was asking if they can mention which part is more of interest to them.
We're
for
going
them.
to be focusing on Copilot on them,
on Copilot,
right?
okay.
And I see here a question: can I use Copilot with older database versions and Synapse dedicated pool? With Synapse dedicated pool, I'm not sure. With older SQL Server versions, definitely yes. I've been using it with SQL 16 with absolutely no problem, right? Of course, we have to get out of SQL Server 16 as soon as possible because of the lack of support tool. But yes, you can use any SQL Server version. For Synapse dedicated pool, I believe it's also possible, but I'm not totally sure. Right? So let's jump to the demo. Let me go to my virtual machine. And I believe that here I'm answering one of the questions, right? So we go up. Here I ask Copilot for one specific procedure, right? USP get bill of materials, right? So it gave me all the explanation with all the parameters, right? And the purpose of this specific procedure, right? How it works, it uses a recursive CTE, it has a date filtering and the output, etc., etc., etc. One of the things that we can ask here is, is this procedure following the best practices. Or again, if we have a procedure which has multiple lines, thousands of lines, we can ask Copilot to analyze it, right? So see here, I haven't opened the Object Explorer. Now I did. I don't see my databases. Now I do, right? But I can ask Copilot at any time with my current connection, right? So what I'm gonna do now is I will connect to AdventureWorks and I will generate a new query. So I'm connected to this database, right? And let me clean the chat, the previous chat, and I can say, list the 10 largest table in the database based on row count, right? So it's going to take some time to go through and dig into the metadata, right? And we'll come up with the list of tables, right? Again, I enter into AdventureWorks, but see here, I haven't expanded, so I don't know the table names, the relationship, I know nothing. So this could be the example that I mentioned before. We are starting a brand new shop as a developer or as a data analyst, for example, and we would like to, get some data. Copilot is still a little bit slow for me, right? But it does its job. It's interesting because this week, actually the last week, Microsoft has announced something that is a little bit strange. And it's mentioning that Copilot can be used for recreational purposes only. Right? This is the very first time I heard about this. Right? So not sure exactly what it means. I believe that they're going to come up with a blog post or something like that, because myself, as a responsible for many databases, right, I don't want my users, my DBAs, to use something for recreational purposes, right? So something that we may need to dig deeper. Let me go here. Not sure why I cannot see my database name. Wait. Wait a second. Let me close and reopen. My management studio. I think I've been having some issues. Yeah. Here we go. The demo bots. Okay, so I can ask Copilot, for example, which SQL Server version am I using? It's gonna, this is a super simple question. Again, it takes quite a while. To me, it's just go and right click or just do select add version and I get it, right? But again, if you want to use this, it just give you, the SQL Server version, the edition, etc., etc., etc. I can ask also how the today, right? And what SQL is going to do is will give me an answer like, I can answer only things related to your database, not general purpose things, right? So here is the answer. I'm giving Copilot, the programming focuses on SQL Server data, not able to provide weather information. And as you can see, I can also make mistake on writing, right, the question, and Copilot will get it for you. So now let's say that I have a list of questions that I would like to ask Copilot, right? Calculate the average vacation hours per job title. This is something that if I'm new developing, right, I will need to learn the architecture, the table names, the column names, the data types, the relationships, build the queries, right? That will take definitely some time. What Copilot is doing here is generating the T-SQL code and giving me the answer, right, in a table format here, and also with an explanation. Can I have the SQL code for that? So now let's say that eventually I want to create a view, right, with this information, right? What I'm just gonna get here is the code on how to retrieve all this, right? If I hit apply here, I'm gonna see my code here, and I can run the query myself, right? Tab. So I can run the same query myself. I can come back here and ask, for example, calculate the current pay rates. All right. Again, I'm here in Object Explorer. I haven't expanded the database. I don't see the table names. I don't see, absolutely anything. Right? I'm blind, right? Copilot is doing all these reverse architecture or reverse engineering, right, on this, right? So perfect, I found human resource employee history, and it's giving me all the explanation on how it gets, the employee name, job title, current pay rate, frequency, etc., etc. I can ask also, give me the employee who pays rate is 50 or more, right? And then we can start digging deeper and, go through the same question. Like, for example, can I have the, and actually this is something that we're gonna do for this specific question. So I have this, right? I have the answer, and I have the code in Python to get this. So this is GitHub Copilot, actually, right? So we can do this with Management Studio or with Visual Studio Code. And, here it's preparing the code, right? Quite interesting here, it's still using the ODBC driver, right? And it's generating the code. And it's giving us all the instruction on how to install everything and run the environment. So super, super, super cool, right? So we can spend the whole day here chatting with our data, right? But you have a sneak peek of what we can do with Copilot, right? So we have complete the presentation. I know I took extra 15 minutes. Sorry about that. There is a lot of content to share. I just wanted to cover it all, and I just wanted you to have a sneak peek of what you can do with Copilot in SQL Server, right? I'm not sure if there are additional questions. I see here one. Have you identified a specific LLM model to select to get great reliable output from Copilot for SQL use? I see you have Sonnet 4.5 selected. Actually, this is the default, right? When you install Management Studio, then you have to go and configure your GitHub Copilot license, right? And when you open it for the very first time, you have a list of models, right? But Sonnet 4.5 is the default one, right? By the way, SQL Copilot was in preview until a couple of weeks ago, even if Management Studio 22 was GA since a while, actually. The preview, it was for Copilot only. In the last version that was released 2-3 weeks ago during the FabCon, SQLCon conference, they released SSMS 22.4.1, in where Copilot is now GA, general available, right? But yes, Sonnet 4.5 is the default model that is used. And of course, it's using the tokens of your GitHub Copilot. So depending on the license that you use, you will be consuming, tokens during the month, etc. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very, very much. And any more questions, just so we know we gave chance to people who didn't know, they were just engrossed in what you were sharing, and maybe now they are thinking about it and they have 1 or 2 questions. We can maybe take, are you okay to handle 2 or 3 more questions? I don't know
Yes,
what
absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Any questions from anyone? Going 1, going 2. And Hannah, I would want to also kind of follow up again on there aspects of what Javier mentioned that you are a lot more interested in. I'm saying this because he presents, like, for me to get in for a sync call, we needed to do a call just to sync on how the session would be. It was not easy because he was always at one conference or the other, and most of these conferences is presenting. So that you might just be lucky that the part that you want that he couldn't demo today, maybe he has demoed it somewhere, and he's able to give you the link.
We can schedule another one, Michael, on the features for developers only, and we do the demo-based presentation on all the features for SQL Server developers, right? This is more a session in where we can see all the features one by one with examples, with demo, right? So it's that slide that I present with the features for SQL Server 2025 for developers, right? Is actually the only slide, and then everything else is demo for each of them, right? So it's super, super cool.
So, okay, that's good to know. So I'll just have it in my note to in future, come back to you on that. Anybody else has a question? I see some thank you. A lot of people did thumbs up when, and they clapped when you got to this slide of Q&A that you had done with the presentation. It was a lot, and I'm already seeing some aspects of what you mentioned that we can take advantage of at where I work. And like I'll speak to my colleagues who, I'm sure they will be happy to know that, there's this feature that, will make things easier and that now I'm aware exists.
I know that there is a ton of context in just a short amount of time.
Okay. Alexander, yes, sorry, I didn't notice.
That's okay. That's okay. For everyone in the session today, I just want to ask you a small favor. We are extremely interested in your feedback on this session, and we want to have a conversation because essentially this is a community activity. It's not that Michael and I are secretly discussing in some back room what we want to present to you. We're lucky to have Javier tonight, of course, but we also want to hear all your ideas about what you want to learn in the sessions. And just to remind you, we have Meetup where you can post your comments. We have a group on LinkedIn This is actually a suggested way for us to communicate. And I ask every one of you who is not yet a member of that group, please go and join there. And there's also a Microsoft Fabric community website where we also have a discussion. It's not easy for us to monitor all of these places, but we try our best. So feel free to use all of them. And specifically, I ask you to complete that poll that Michael presented in the chat earlier with the link, because this is very important for all of us and for Javier. If he sees that people are not answering that poll, he might think that we didn't like his presentation at all. Like, how we are supposed to lure him in next time? He's a very busy and popular person. We need to be grateful, and here being grateful means communicate back. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. And I've shared the link so that you can easily just click, and it's kind of straightforward. So I think that brings us officially to the end of today's session. Again, thank you very, very much, Javier. How do I say thank you in will it be Spanish, or will it be Portuguese, or what?
Spanish.
Spanish. I think I know that. That's just gracias, right?
Gracias, gracias.
Yeah, I know that. So gracias, and this is a lot that you've given us in terms of what's new, what's there that we have not been aware of, and I know that many of us, I for one, I see myself better now in as regards Azure SQL and all that is available based on what you've shared. And I know a lot of people too are feeling the same way about your session. Thank you very, very much. And I think we'll let you go have the rest of it's already night, I guess, and like go rest. And to
All
everybody who
right.
joined.
Thank you so much. And well, see you soon.
Yes,
Thank
thank you.
you.
And thank you to everyone who joined. Have a good week ahead. Thanks, Alex. And thanks, everyone. Bye. Gonna end the meeting.